welcome everyone. I'm Ari Lax, and today, fresh off of Tom's top 4 finish at SCG Louisville, we're bringing back the rack. This deck's interesting. I've liked smallpox decks recently in Modern, so it goes to say that playing with a different smallpox deck is not out of reason, and I really can't stop myself from just playing Thoughtseize. It's really absurd. The card's just really fun for me, and probably very unfun for my opponents. The deck is not very complex. You just make your opponent discard cards. I did message Tom a bit and pick his brain for a couple of things that I had questions on in the deck. Um, so I'll get into those as we go through the whole breakdown. A bunch of basic swamps. You are not messing around on that front. Your deck is not getting Blood Mooned anytime soon. A bunch of Urborgs. You can overload on Urborgs because of playing cards like Raven's Crime and Smallpox to utilize the extra copies, or Liliana the Veil. Um, but all the copies of Urborg let you have Mutavault as a way to kill your opponent without really cutting into your black mana. There's also some like super minor things you can pull with like Funeral Charm and Mutavault to give it Swamp Walk or sideboard at Death Shadows or whatever. But the all swamps thing is mostly for Mutavault, because your lands are generally swamps anyways. Other than that, and to quote Tom, the Marsh Flats was to put the fear in them or something like that. I don't really get it, but I'm not going to change what worked. You have your 8 real win conditions with Shrieking Affliction and the Rack. Um, Notable differences between the two. Uh, if you don't really have your opponent in the hard lock, it's actually kind of easy for them to break out of Affliction if their deck has some cards like Snapcaster Mage or Finks that allow them to commit to the battlefield without really sacrificing too many cards. Whereas the Rack will chip away. Being an artifact makes the Rack a little more vulnerable than being an enchantment. It's just a lot of random stuff that can kill artifacts that people will just have because they want to have it, like Ancient Grudge. Worth noting, the Rack deals damage, whereas Shrieking Affliction is loss of life, so the Rack can actually kill Planeswalkers. Um, it's actually a pretty important uh, play to make with this deck, because otherwise you're hard pressed to handle like a top deck Planeswalker if your opponent dumps their hand. Moving on to the raw discard, we have 7, pick a card and discarded effects. 4 Inquisition, 3 Thoughtseize. Biasing towards Inquisition, both because the life loss is relevant, but also because the fact that Thoughtseize taking 4 drops is less relevant when your opponent's going to be discarding all their cards. So it's hard for them to have lands and 4 drops left over when they discarded so many cards. So the cards that Thoughtseize is beating are generally mitigated otherwise. You have Raven's Crime. It's kind of your engine to prevent you from flooding out. So you can actually just always burn their entire hand and then get to a state where you're actually doing something. And then Wrenchmind as your main deck 2 for 1. There isn't really anything else that kind of does what this card does. You don't want a ton because it can be a liability. It's a little clunky at 2 mana. Sometimes you're just better off smoothly deploying other things. But it does the job of being a 2 for 1, which none of your other cards really do. You have a bunch of Fatal Push, which is a pretty big gain from the last time I played this deck, because I think you had to be mono Dismembers. You have ways to pick off the small creatures, and again, the delta between Dismember and Fatal Push, something like, Thought Out Seer is probably not the best example, like Reality Smasher maybe. Um, Again, you're talking about a deck that's making your opponent discard so many cards that it's hard for them to cast these 4 and 5 drops that would be, or I guess 5 drops really is where obviously Fatal Push cuts out, but you don't have a lot of ways to trigger a Volt. You can like Urborg your own Urborg or Smallpox or something. So Fatal Push is kind of capped at 2 in this deck, but again, like I said, a lot of the stuff that Fatal Push would be uh, struggling to handle is just not going to matter against your discard. You got a couple Funeral Charms to pick off smaller creatures, which is nice because a lot of the matches where picking off smaller creatures matters are ones where Funeral, or we're picking off more creatures matters are the ones where they have smaller creatures that you can Funeral Charm. In fact, the Collecting Company or Elf, those 2 decks are obviously the same, but kind of in my mind, I'm thinking like the Counters Company deck or Elves or something. We want to pick off a bunch of creatures. Smallpox is an absolutely brutal magic card in this deck. The idea of it, I guess, because you have no creatures, this card is always maintaining parity. But because trading resource parity for this deck is great, you know, you can discard an extra card. You are probably gonna have some bad cards, lands. You know, these are not resources you care about, but you're killing an opponent's creature. They care about cards in hand way more than you. You know, forcing that exchange is what your deck is trying to do. And then Liliana the Veil, another great removal spell that's also a pseudo win condition for your deck because getting its ultimate probably wins the game. Um, and also puts your opponent into the rack hard locked. Moving to the sideboard, there's some interesting stuff going on here. So, last Fatal Push, the round out removal suite. We have a couple Bontu's Last Reckoning to cover against decks that can go wider than your discard, like Collected Company decks, to cover against bigger decks that can go around your Fatal Pushes, like Eldrazi. Ley Lines, because you got to beat Dredge somehow, though I think that there's a lot of matches you're going to board in a couple of these. A Shadow of Doubt to KO various search effects, Primeval Titans, things like that. Delirium Skeins. I asked Tom about this. My initial thought was that this was a card to really KO combo decks because you can get them into a point where they're like sandbagging their combo, trying to hit their land, and then you just cast this and just wrecks their hand. It actually does something that impacts the game, unlike some of the less wider reaching discard. But it's really there for filling out the deck. I mean, it's good against those matchups, but when you're sideboarding out your removal, you want a generic good card to fill out the deck sometimes, and this does that. I think that the amount that you sideboard in given matchups is going to vary depending just on counts. So that's worth noting. And then we've got an Asylum Visitor. Good with Smallpox because you are casting it after it resolves. Good with Liliana. A way to churn cards in matchups where you do need to do that. Collected Company is definitely a matchup where you have to do that. There's just matchups where your opponent's going to have enough 2-for-1 random things that you have to be able to go up a little on cards. And then Shadow against aggressive decks and Burn as a way to punish them for attacking you. On top of with your discard strategy, you actually have to have some way to stabilize the board, turn the corner, that kind of stuff, and not just take a bunch of damage if they're getting out underneath your discard. So yeah, that's the rack. It was a lot of words for a mono black discard deck, but the cards do matter in theory, and hopefully your opponent cards don't. And worth noting, we are going to be on the draw as many games as we can because that is apparently the truth. So doing it up Tom Ross style.